The Shepnaz podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today. This past Sunday, Pastor Nick, who's normally our campus pastor up in Johnstown, is down in Gahanna, and he was able to bring us the message here. While he was doing that, Noah Burris, our worship leader up in Johnstown, was actually delivering the message up in Johnstown. So tomorrow you'll get to hear a little bit about his message, as I had the opportunity to sit down and talk with him about that. But today we're going to check in with Pastor Nick, who has absolutely nothing going on in his life and has just been waiting for the opportunity to add one more thing.
Yep.
So
nothing. People keep asking me, Nick, are you tired? You look tired. Are you stressed? You look stressed. I'm like, man, I got to work on that, I think. So sorry.
At least you're being authentic, right? I mean, you're not
That's
like
true.
trying to put on a mask or anything
That's
like
true.
that.
I say, yeah.
Well,
a few things going on.
Yeah, you've recently had a baby, and so how's all that going?
Oh, it's going good. I think everyone's adjusting well. We're finding the rhythms and routines that are important, and everyone's happy and healthy for the most part. But yeah, it's all good.
All right. And also things happening at the church, and it's picking up pace pretty quick now at this point. So you want to give any updates on that?
Well, the big thing we're quickly approaching on is being able to be in our new space for worship. And so that's less than a week from this day. And we're just finishing up the little details. And of course, there'll be things as we go along too, but being able to get in there is something that we've been working toward for a long time, and just really excited about getting in there. Just as I've been over the last few weeks that we've been able to be back in there, just looking at the big empty room and using that time as a time just to pray and just envision what God will do in that space and in and through the people specifically there in Johnstown.
Speaking of which, I think this week you're planning on meeting for prayer before we ever have any services. Yep. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
That just was something that really came upon me at just one day. I thought, man, the first thing that we should do, the first thing that should be done in that space is prayer. And we are a people of prayer. We want this church, Shepherd Church, to be a church of prayer, a culture of prayer. And so just thought that would be good for us to do, is to get in there before we have worship services and pray for God that God would use that space to change lives, to change eternities. And so that's what we're going to do. On Thursday, we'll be there at the church in the new space from 6:30 to 7:30. Very informal. So if anyone that's listening to this wants to come by, you can join us for prayer. We'll just pray for all of those things and prayer requests, and it'll be a good time.
Amen. All right. So we're going to get a little bit into the message. Some of this content is going to potentially be different than what you were talking about on Sunday, because there's a couple different angles you might want to take on this, and a little bit different discussion points. We're going to take a look in Matthew chapter 16, although this is also recorded in some of the other Gospels as well. Matthew 16, starting with verse number 13, and I'll read from the NLT version.
Awesome.
When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" "Well," they replied, "some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say Jeremiah or one of the other prophets." Then he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. Now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock. And upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven." Then he sternly warned the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the religious law. He would be killed, but on the third day he would be raised from the dead. But Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him, saying such things, "Heaven forbid, Lord." He said, "This will never happen to you." Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get away from me, Satan. You are a dangerous trap for me. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? For the Son of Man will come with his angels in glory of his Father, and will judge all people according to their deeds. And I tell you the truth, some standing here right now will not die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." All right, well, there is a lot there to unpack. Where would you like to start?
Well, good old Peter, right? The relatable Peter. I think to many of us, and I think last time I was on the podcast, talked about the calling of Peter and just being able to relate to him for a lot of different ways. One of the main ways is that Peter wasn't perfect, like none of us are perfect. And so if you follow his faith journey, you'll see that. You'll see the relatability to him and just how his mess ups are sometimes how we mess up, and how in his journey following Jesus, there's highs and lows. And so Joe, I just thought it would be cool to ask you, what has your faith journey looked like over the years that you've been following Jesus? Have there been moments of highs and lows? You don't have to go into specific details, but I think that's something that we all experience, and just being able to share what that looks like and it has been for us is good.
It's all been very even keel. Everything has always gone well in my life.
Said yes to Jesus, and here you are.
Never had any problems.
Smiles every day.
But no, actually, I live on this planet, so that's not the way life has been. I was raised in a Christian home, and I was a PK pretty early on. Actually, when I was in elementary ages, my dad was a worship leader, is what we'd call him today. Back then, it was like music director.
Yeah.
But then he got called into ministry, and so I kind of entered the world of being a PK and everything that comes with that. And but there's been so many things that on one level I could look and say my life has just consistently been blessed. And that's if I took all the great things that have happened, it would just look like one long line of blessing after blessing. Or I could take the other view and tell you about every horrible thing that has happened, and I could say it's just been one horrible thing after another. And but I've seen God be consistent through all of that. And for me, there's definitely been times when I look back at the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace. And there's definitely been times when he didn't save me from the fire, but he went through it with me. And then there's definitely been other times where he just miraculously would. And I'll give two quick personal examples, and maybe that will suffice for what you're wanting to hear. But, I was 18 years old, and as I told you, I was in a pastor's family, and believe it or not, I was running sound at a church, at my dad's church, and my sister was supposed to be singing, because back in that day, it was just typical to have a special song, during the middle of the service, and so somebody would get up and sing.
I remember those.
A special song. And so my sister was supposed to be there, and she didn't show up, and it was so weird. And she was 22 years old, married, and at that time, probably 5 to 6 months pregnant. And so we were like, well, just have to move on and we'll catch up with her later. And I sang a song to fill the spot. And then it was hours later we found out that she had died in a car accident on the way to church to sing. And it was devastating. I can remember. I mean, even as soon as I start to talk about it, all the emotions and just my heart starts beating in my chest, and I think about how that day played out and like how low that moment was. But even through that, we saw so many people come to Christ. And I would never say, okay, so this was, an equal exchange. He did this so he could do that. I don't think God is quite that transactional in our relationships, but we do have the promise in Romans 8 that he'll take those things and he'll use them for great. So certainly I've had, tragedy and some horrible things that have happened. I've seen God been faithful through that. And then I can also think of the time of the blessing of my kids being born, of getting married, and even a miraculous kind of deliverance in that situation where before we had Luke, the guy that's up there playing bass and playing drums, Susan was facing some health problems, and we had discovered those health problems. And at the time, she was not pregnant, but we had already had 3 children. And the doctor said, "Well, don't have any more children right now." And as it turned out, we found out a month later she was pregnant. So it's like, well, I guess we are. And so that doctor said, "You should terminate this pregnancy because your health is at serious risk." And so that was a challenging time. And we took it to the Lord in prayer, and we said, "You know what? Whatever you decide is what's going to happen. We're not going to decide it. And so we're just going to take this a day at a time." We found a Christian doctor that walked us through. And you've seen the end of the story. He's perfectly fine. Susan's perfectly fine. And so we've seen kind of both the highs and lows as God has carried us through.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something I think if we had every person that listens to the podcast on, they'd be able to share similar type of experiences of just the high moments and the low moments. And even when if we look at Peter, we see the same things. And even I think if I could press in even more specifically, we know that God has always been faithful. You alluded to that. God has always been faithful, and those are the high moments, and even in the low moments, God is faithful. But what about specifically the low moments of ourselves? The low moments where maybe we haven't been faithful? Because that's, in this story about Peter, we see Jesus goes through this interaction with Peter, and he's asking the disciples, "Who do you say I am?" Some say John the Baptist, Elijah, prophet, other prophets, but Jesus says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "Well, you're the Messiah. You're the Christ." And both of those titles are translated in English to anointed one, saying you are the one that we've been expecting. You are the promised one, the one that's coming to save and to make things right. That's who you are, Jesus. And then Jesus goes on to explain to what that means. But before he does that, he says, "Peter, upon you, I'm going to build my church." And then he goes in to explain, and here's what's to expect of the Messiah and the anointed one. He will suffer and die. And Peter's not okay with that. So he takes Jesus, and it's a bold move to take Jesus aside and reprimand him, Yeah. But that's kind of person Peter was. That's the word I use for that is passionate. Peter was passionate, and so he takes Jesus aside and reprimands him, says, "No way, Jesus, that's not going to happen to you." And then what does Jesus do? Reprimands Peter, says, "Get behind me, Satan." So there's this high moment of faithfulness when Peter says, "You're the Messiah," and then Jesus says, "Yes, I will. Upon you, Peter, I will build my church." And then to go from that to this moment of correction and rebuke to Peter, there's this high and low moments. Have you experienced that in your life, where maybe you've done something for God and you felt good about it, and like, well, yeah, that was great, and then not too long after, probably, where you're like, well, I messed that one up.
Sure.
I mean, I know I have in times where you're like, yeah, that you're feeling good, and over a course of maybe a long while, several days, weeks, where you're just, things are going great, and then all of a sudden you have a moment where you mess up. And that's what we see in Peter's, not just here, but continually.
Yeah.
And so what I mentioned on Sunday was that following Jesus is not about being perfect, but it's about being perfected. It's about following Jesus and allowing the Spirit to work in us and through us continually, ongoing, making us into the likeness of Christ. And so we see this story where Jesus reprimands Peter, and then he goes on to, if we identify really what Peter, what the cause of that was Peter was projecting his own will and his own way onto Jesus, saying, because Peter had this own idea of messiahship in his head, and so it didn't line up with what Jesus was explaining. He says, "No way, Jesus," because his view, his idea, his own will, and his own way for Jesus was not what Jesus was sharing. And I think it's important to point out, Peter had good intentions, right?
Right.
Saying he didn't want Jesus to die, obviously first of all, that's not what he thought the Messiah would be and what it would look like, but also because he cared about Jesus. He left everything to follow him. And so for these good intentions, Peter's like, "No way, that's not going to happen to you." And I think we can easily do that too, is we can have good intentions about doing this or doing that for God, praying for God to do things. But if we uncover it a little bit more, it might be, what we might find is we're praying and doing things in our own will, in our own way. And I know this is put down here in my notes, this is something that I find myself doing at times, praying for God to do things in a way that I would prefer, or that I would see, or that I would envision in my own time, in the timing of things. Trust me, we've gone through this renovation project. I've prayed a lot for God. Here's the timeline. I have good intentions, sure. And I think that's what's so tricky about this, is that sometimes when we talk about, if we're living with our own will and our own way and our own purposes instead of God's, we think it's going to look some kind of like, this is so in your face. But a lot of times it's very subtle. We're not always overtly defiant to God's way, are we?
Right. And I guess I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I'm just thinking about the passage that we were reading when he's saying, "Take up your cross daily." It kind of puts me in mind of that. Like, there's on a daily basis, I'm going to have to put my will aside.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to have to just and that's why our prayer life is so critical, is because each day I really need to make sure that I'm following his will, his way, his time, because it's so easy for, especially if you're a driven person and you're goal oriented, and that's what we see.
And you're
here
doing good things.
Yeah, and we see it here in Peter. Like, he's wanting to do the right things. He thinks that he has a bead on what direction it should go. And so he's trying to push that direction, so much so that he gets bold enough to think that Jesus is wrong about where it's going to go.
Yeah. And see, we would read this story and hear this story and think, oh, we would never do that, right? We would never reprimand or rebuke Jesus. But I think sometimes we live that way. We live that way and thinking, we know better. And so why it might not be like overtly like, Jesus, come here, I'm going to tell you how it is. But my question for all of us listening is what do we do with our desires, my wants, my way of thinking? And Jesus goes on to say in the passage the remedy for that, the remedy for getting out of our own will and our own way. And it's something that's not necessarily the most woohoo, like the most encouraging thing to hear from Jesus. But he says exactly what you shared. Those of you who want to be my follower must take up your cross and die. And Joe, I just wanted to ask you, what does that look like? Because it's not literally, right?
Yeah.
It's not literal.
We certainly hope not. Although there is definitely martyrs in the world today, and some numbers show that there's more today than there ever has been. Do I think that's happening to me personally? No, not in my setting. For me, I think the way this plays out is that, we recently did the Shape for Greatness series and kind of did some introspective of our personality types and where our gifts are. And, we talked about the pros and cons of those things. And I definitely saw all the cons that were flashing up to me. Like, I have to be mindful of these things. I have to be mindful that I don't get too project and task oriented, that like Jesus may be more concerned about me going over and just talking to this person and sharing with them a few minutes instead of trying to get the next thing done. And I have to be mindful of that. And I was sharing a little bit before, in my personal prayer life, I kind of have to make sure that I put whatever plans, desires, I put that under his direction and recognize that I'll get it wrong. It's easy to do that if you're trying something. If you're constantly trying things, then there's a pretty good chance you'll get it wrong. But to be able
guaranteed.
But to be able to go back to him and say, okay, and I love this passage that just exposes how raw the relationship was between Peter and Jesus. Number one, that Jesus was the kind of leader where Peter felt like he could walk up to him and say, I think you got this one wrong. I mean, that speaks well of Jesus as a leader, that he thinks he could do that. But then also, Jesus is not bashful either.
No.
Oh, well, we're going to have this conversation. Okay. Well, you're Satan.
Yeah, exactly. That, I mean, we have to be a correctable people, right?
Yeah.
To where we have to allow ourselves to be exposed, for Jesus to be able to speak, for the Spirit to reveal areas of our lives that, hey, you've been doing it this way, and that's not his way. And to allow ourselves to then come with humility and repentance ultimately in that. And maybe it's something that we're doing or with good intention and says, no, stop doing that. Or maybe the Spirit exposes like, hey, you didn't give it over completely. And And that's what I wrote down here in my notes, that when Jesus gives us this call, this command that if we are to follow him, we must give up our own way, take up our cross and follow him. Why that can be so hard. Well, let me first ask, do you think that's easy or hard for people?
Oh, I think it's always difficult to give up our own way because...
that was kind of a leading question. Yeah. I was hoping you'd say that.
we tend to be the hero of our own story, yes. And we think
we know best,
yes, yeah.
Right? We know our lives. We know the things around us. We think we have the solution for things, and that's not the case, right? Why that is so hard, then, I think... did I cut you off?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Why I think that is so hard is because what Jesus is calling us to do is to surrender and to submit. Now, those two words are not the most inviting words and most, I can get behind that words, because we see those things, I think, in society and our culture. Just listen to the words surrender and submit. We see those two words as weakness, right? Yeah. And we don't want to be weak. We don't want to be seen that way. We don't want to feel that way. And I think that's what the enemy has kind of tricked us in, thinking like, oh, if you surrender your own will and way, and if you submit to Jesus, like you're giving up, you're losing, you're weak. And it's the complete opposite. There's a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer that I shared that talks about how we think the cross, or sometimes we can think the cross is the end, but it's really just the beginning. It's the beginning of the life that's found in Jesus, the resurrection life, and that's something that's there's no weakness with that, because the strength is in Christ, not in ourselves. And so I think we have to be careful about that, and letting the enemy twist those two things to keep us from giving up ourselves and taking up our cross. One of the final passages I just want to end with here before our time is from Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. What this looks like, what the challenge that was presented is that we give God our all, that God wants all of us. And that's what the call to take up our cross is. And there's other parts of Scripture that back this up, that we give God all of who we are. And that's what we see here in Romans chapter 12. Verse 1 says this: "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies." Bodies there is like your entire self. All of you, offer all of who you are as a living sacrifice that's holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern. So that first part, before I go, that first part is what we do. We offer, consecrate. God, we give you ourselves for your purposes, for what you want to do, for your will and your way. And then this second part is what God does. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. God does the transformation in us by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. His will is good, pleasing, and perfect. And so with that, just want to encourage you all today who are listening to allow yourselves to be examined, allow Jesus to expose maybe areas of your life where you've been living your will or your way, or maybe been withholding, and just see what happens from that. Anything else, Joe?
I think that'll do it. If you're listening today and you realized, hey, I'm not perfect, great. That's the place that you need to be, because Jesus came for the imperfect, and we come to find out there are none that are perfect. If he can do it through Peter, he can do it through you, and we just encourage you to take that challenge today, to take up your cross and to follow him. You can keep up with everything that's going on at the church by going to shepnaz.org. For Pastor Nick, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.